the internet didn't catch this moment by accident, it pounced on it. Because when Papoose finally said the words, "I love you," in a moment that fans swear didn't happen until after weeks of blog pressure and public scrutiny, the reaction was instant and explosive. Not because those words are rare, but because of when they were said, how they were said, and who seemed to push them out. For weeks, blogs had been circling the situation like sharks. Every silence dissected, every appearance analyzed, every pause treated like strategy. And right in the middle of that pressure cooker sat Claressa Shields, emotionally visible, repeatedly scrutinized, and widely criticized for wanting clarity out loud. Critics said she was doing too much. Supporters said she was asking for the bare minimum. And then suddenly, Papoose said it. "I love you," not shouted, not dramatized, but clear enough that the internet froze for a second before erupting. Because to many people watching, it didn't feel spontaneous. It felt reactive, like a response to mounting pressure. Like a line crossed only after blogs, commentary channels, and public narratives made staying silent riskier than speaking. That's where the controversy begins. Fans immediately split into camps. One side celebrated, saying Claressa finally got verbal affirmation and public acknowledgement after weeks of emotional imbalance. They argued that sometimes people need to be pushed to show up properly, especially when silence causes harm. The other side wasn't convinced. They questioned whether love should ever need an audience to be spoken, and whether words said under pressure carry the same weight as those offered freely. What made this moment even more complicated was Papoose's apparent awareness of the blogs themselves. Viewers noticed how closely his timing aligned with peak online criticism, how phrases seemed tailored not just to Claressa, but to the narrative surrounding them. That fueled speculation that the blogs weren't just reporting the story, they were shaping behavior inside it. And Claressa, her reaction mattered just as much as his words. To supporters, it looked like relief, validation after being made to feel exposed. To critics, it looked like confirmation that public pressure works. But either way, the dynamic shifted. Because once "I love you" is said publicly, the story changes, and so do the expectations. This isn't just about 3 words, it's about why they came when they did. It's about whether emotional reassurance should follow vulnerability, or whether it should exist without being demanded. And it's about how much power blogs and public opinion now hold in shaping private relationships. Because when love is spoken after pressure, the question isn't "was it real?" It's "why did it take this long, and who was it really for?" The first thing fans noticed wasn't just what Papoose said, it was the sequence. Timing became everything. For weeks, the narrative had been one-sided in terms of emotional visibility. Claressa Shields spoke openly. She was scrutinized, criticized, psychoanalyzed, and reduced to headlines about arguing for love. Meanwhile, Papoose remained largely quiet, occasionally appearing unbothered, while blogs and commentators debated his intentions on his behalf. That imbalance set the stage for what happened next and why the words "I love you" landed the way they did. From the outside, it looked like pressure building in layers. First came speculation, then judgment, then mockery, then concern. Blogs questioned why he wouldn't affirm her publicly. Comment sections filled with variations of the same question: "Why let her take all the heat if you care?" That question didn't disappear, it grew louder. And when enough voices repeat the same demand, it starts to feel less like commentary and more like a countdown. That's why, when Papoose finally said, "I love you," people didn't just hear affection, they heard response. Not necessarily insincere, but reactive, as if the moment was shaped by external forces rather than internal impulse. Fans replayed clips, scrutinizing tone, posture, eye contact. Was it relaxed? Was it firm? Was it reluctant? The analysis wasn't fair, but it was inevitable because the words came after silence, not alongside it. For Claressa's supporters, this moment felt vindicating. They argued she hadn't been asking for grand gestures or theatrics, just acknowledgement. Just reassurance that the emotional risk she took wasn't one-sided. To them, hearing "I love you" wasn't about winning a public argument. It was about balance being restored, even if late. They pointed out that emotional affirmation shouldn't be treated like leverage. It should flow naturally when care exists. But skeptics weren't convinced. They questioned why those words came only after blogs began framing Papoose as indifferent, why it took public pressure rather than private clarity, and whether saying "I love you" under scrutiny carries the same meaning as saying it unprompted. To them, this moment raised an uncomfortable possibility, that the internet didn't just observe the relationship, it influenced it. Another layer that made this moment feel uneasy was Papoose's apparent awareness of the blogs themselves. Viewers noticed subtle cues suggesting he knew exactly what was being said online. That awareness blurred the line between personal communication and public performance. When someone speaks with the audience in mind, even unconsciously, the message becomes layered. Is it for the person, the critics, or damage control? Claressa's reaction added complexity rather than clarity. She didn't gloat, she didn't escalate, she didn't frame it as a victory. Her demeanor suggested relief more than triumph, which supporters interpreted as confirmation that she wasn't manipulating the moment, but waiting for reassurance that should have come sooner. Critics, however, saw that same relief as evidence that public pressure worked, reinforcing the idea that vulnerability can force outcomes, a dangerous takeaway. What troubled many observers was the precedent this moment seemed to set. If blogs and public commentary can push someone into verbal affirmation, what does that say about boundaries? About privacy? About authenticity? The idea that relationships might now be negotiated through headlines rather than conversations unsettled people who saw this as more than celebrity drama, as a reflection of modern intimacy under surveillance. This first phase of the story didn't answer whether Papoose meant what he said. That's unknowable to anyone but him. What it exposed instead was how public pressure reshapes perception. Even genuine words can feel compromised when they arrive late. Even sincere love can be questioned when it appears reactive. And once doubt enters the equation, it lingers. The bigger issue here isn't whether "I love you" was real. It's whether Claressa should have ever been placed in a position where she had to endure weeks of scrutiny to receive basic emotional affirmation. It's whether silence was a strategy, a comfort zone, or a miscalculation. And it's whether the internet's role in this moment should be celebrated or feared. As this chapter closed, the dynamic had shifted but not resolved. The words were spoken, but the questions remained. And in a culture where timing often outweighs content, that delay may matter more than anyone wants to admit. As the story moved into its second phase, the focus shifted away from the words themselves and onto the conditions that produced them. Because once the initial shock faded, people weren't debating whether "I love you" is meaningful. They were interrogating why it appeared when it did, and what that timing revealed about the dynamic playing out under public surveillance. This phase was defined by discomfort. Not outrage, not celebration, discomfort. The kind that creeps in when a private affirmation feels shaped by public commentary. Viewers began tracing the timeline with precision. The rise in blog coverage, the spike in criticism aimed at Papoose's silence, the mounting pressure on Claressa as the visibly emotional party, and then the sudden shift. The sequence felt too neat for some, too coincidental for others. And once people start believing behavior is reactive, even sincere moments get viewed through a defensive lens. A recurring question dominated this phase. Should reassurance require pressure? Supporters of Claressa argued that reassurance shouldn't be rationed or delayed until a narrative becomes uncomfortable. They pointed out that emotional affirmation is not a favor. It's a baseline in any relationship where care exists. From that perspective, the timing didn't cheapen the words. It exposed how long they had been withheld. To them, the problem wasn't that he said it after blogs talked, it was that he didn't say it before. On the other side, critics argued that public affirmation loses authenticity when it appears reactive. They worried about the implication that outside voices can influence intimate expression. If blogs can push someone to say, "I love you," they asked, what else can they push? Apologies? Commitments? Performative gestures designed to quiet criticism rather than deepen connection. That concern wasn't about Papoose specifically, it was about how relationships function when an audience is watching. This phase also brought renewed scrutiny to Claressa's position. Some people accused her of forcing the moment by being emotionally visible, suggesting that her openness cornered Papoose into responding. Supporters pushed back strongly against that narrative, calling it unfair and backward. They argued that expressing feelings isn't coercion, it's communication. And if someone feels pressured by honesty, the issue isn't the honesty. It's the environment that punishes silence only after damage is done. What complicated everything further was how blogs framed the moment. Headlines didn't just report the words, they contextualized them as a reaction. Phrases like "after pressure," "after backlash," and "after weeks of criticism" were attached to the declaration, whether intentionally or not. That framing mattered. It told audiences how to interpret the moment before they ever watched it themselves. And once framed as reactive, it was almost impossible to hear the words without skepticism. Another layer emerged around control of narrative. For weeks, the narrative had been shaped by absence, by what wasn't being said. Claressa's emotional visibility filled that space, but at a cost. When Papoose finally spoke, he didn't just enter the conversation, he redirected it. Suddenly, the focus wasn't on the imbalance that preceded the declaration, but on the declaration itself. That pivot benefited him more than it benefited her, some argued, because it shifted scrutiny away from silence and toward sentiment. Claressa's reaction during this phase remained measured. She didn't weaponize the moment. She didn't frame it as proof that she'd been right all along. She didn't escalate. That restraint mattered to supporters because it undercut claims that she was chasing public validation. Her demeanor suggested something quieter, relief mixed with caution, not triumph recognition. And that nuance got lost in louder debates about whether the moment should have happened at all. This phase also forced people to confront how modern relationships are mediated by commentary. When every pause is interpreted and every word is amplified, communication becomes performative whether you want it to or not. Saying nothing becomes a statement. Saying something becomes strategy. And authenticity gets trapped in the middle, constantly questioned by observers who weren't present for the private conversations that may or may not have happened. Some viewers began asking whether the real issue was never the declaration, but the delay. Why did Claressa have to endure weeks of speculation, ridicule, and emotional exposure before receiving public affirmation? Why was reassurance reactive instead of proactive? Those questions lingered because they spoke to a deeper imbalance, one where emotional labor was unevenly distributed and only corrected once the imbalance became inconvenient. Others cautioned against overreading the moment. They argued that not everyone processes emotion publicly or on the internet's timeline. That Papoose may have needed time, privacy, or distance to articulate his feelings. That assuming malice or manipulation from delay alone is unfair. And those points carried weight. But they didn't fully erase the discomfort created by the timing, especially given the surrounding context. What became clear in this phase is that words don't exist in isolation. They carry the weight of what came before them. When "I love you" follows weeks of silence and scrutiny, it doesn't land the same way it would have earlier. That doesn't make it false, it makes it complicated. And complexity is hard to sit with in online spaces that crave clean narratives. As this chapter drew to a close, the story didn't feel resolved. The declaration changed the temperature, but not the underlying questions. People were left wondering whether reassurance had arrived too late to undo the imbalance that preceded it, whether the internet had overstepped by shaping private expression, and whether Claressa's emotional risk had been worth the outcome. This phase didn't deliver answers, it exposed fault lines between privacy and publicity, between reassurance and reaction, between love expressed freely and love expressed under watch. And once those fault lines are visible, they don't disappear just because the right words are finally spoken. By the time this situation reached its third phase, the conversation had shifted yet again, away from the words "I love you" themselves, and toward what they ultimately changed and what they didn't. Because once the initial reactions settled, people began asking a quieter but more revealing question. Did this moment actually rebalance the dynamic, or did it simply pause the discomfort? What became clear is that the declaration altered the optics, not the history. It softened the harshest criticism aimed at Papoose's silence, but it didn't erase the weeks where Claressa Shield stood alone in the public eye, carrying emotional weight that wasn't evenly shared. For many supporters, that distinction mattered deeply. They weren't denying that love could be real. They were questioning why reassurance arrived only after pressure made the absence impossible to ignore. This phase was marked by reassessment. Fans revisited everything that came before with new eyes. Claressa's emotional posts no longer looked like overreactions. They looked like attempts to bridge a gap that hadn't been acknowledged. Papoose's silence no longer looked neutral. It looked consequential. And the blogs that once felt like background noise now appeared to have played an active role in shaping how and when intimacy was expressed. Some people began calling this a textbook example of reactive affirmation, not insincere, but delayed until silence carried reputational risk. That framing wasn't about attacking intent, it was about naming impact. When one partner must endure public vulnerability before receiving reassurance, the reassurance doesn't land as grounding, it lands as corrective. And correction, even when welcomed, doesn't feel the same as care freely given. Others pushed back, urging nuance. They argued that relationships aren't linear, that timing doesn't automatically invalidate emotion, and that outside pressure doesn't negate internal truth. They reminded everyone that the public only sees fragments, not the private conversations that may have preceded or followed the declaration. Those arguments were fair, but they didn't fully resolve the discomfort, because the public context was inseparable from the moment itself. Claressa's position in this phase became especially complex. She wasn't celebrating. She wasn't escalating. She wasn't retreating into silence either. Her presence felt cautious, as if she understood that while the moment shifted the narrative, it didn't automatically heal what had been strained. Supporters interpreted that caution as wisdom, an awareness that words spoken publicly don't instantly undo weeks of imbalance. What also emerged in this phase was a deeper conversation about emotional labor. People began naming the invisible work Claressa had been doing, holding her feelings while being judged for expressing them, managing public perception while processing private hurt, and absorbing commentary that questioned her dignity simply for wanting clarity. When the declaration finally came, it didn't retroactively compensate for that labor. It highlighted how much of it had gone unacknowledged. Another uncomfortable realization surfaced. The internet had learned it could influence outcomes. Whether intentionally or not, blogs and commentary channels appeared to have played a role in shifting behavior. That realization unsettled many viewers because it blurred the line between observation and intervention. When public pressure can shape private expression, it raises ethical questions about how much access audiences should have to unfinished emotional stories. This phase also exposed how relief can coexist with resentment. Claressa may have felt validated hearing the words she'd been waiting for, but validation doesn't automatically erase the memory of waiting. Supporters recognized that complexity, pushing back against narratives that framed the declaration as a simple win. They argued that love isn't a trophy, and reassurance isn't a reward for endurance. It's a necessity that loses power when delayed too long. As the noise quieted, some fans began expressing hope, not that the story would continue publicly, but that it would move out of the public eye entirely. They wanted Claressa protected from further scrutiny, not fed into another cycle of interpretation. They wanted Papoose to show consistency, not just response. And they wanted the blogs to step back, recognizing that not every moment of intimacy needs an audience to validate it. At the same time, skepticism lingered. People questioned whether the dynamic had truly changed or simply adapted to scrutiny, whether future reassurance would come proactively or only when silence became costly again. Those questions couldn't be answered yet, but they mattered because they reflected a growing awareness of how patterns form under pressure. What this third phase ultimately revealed is that words can shift narratives without resolving them. I love you changed the temperature, but it didn't erase the imbalance that preceded it. It didn't undo the public judgment Claressa faced, and it didn't answer the deeper question of why emotional clarity arrived so late. This chapter didn't end in conflict or celebration. It ended in reflection. Reflection on timing, on power, on how public attention reshapes private relationships, and on how easily love, when spoken under watch, becomes something people debate instead of something people feel. In the end, the most lasting takeaway wasn't about whether the declaration was real. It was about what it took to get there, about the cost of waiting, about the weight of silence, and about how, once the internet enters a relationship, even the most intimate words carry echoes far beyond the two people they're meant for. That's where this story rests now, not resolved, not inflamed, but suspended. A reminder that love spoken publicly can bring relief, but it can also leave behind unanswered questions that only time and consistency can answer. Before you scroll away, stop for a second, because this moment says a lot more than 3 words ever could. What you just watched wasn't about celebrating a declaration or tearing one apart. It was about timing, pressure, and what it costs when reassurance comes after silence. And that's a conversation most people avoid because it's uncomfortable, but it matters. If this made you think, don't let that reflection disappear into the feed. Like this video to support conversations that slow things down instead of rushing to verdicts. Comment with what stood out to you, not to pick sides, but to talk about emotional balance, public pressure, and how love should or shouldn't show up when the world is watching. And subscribe, because stories like this don't end with one moment. They reveal patterns, and patterns only make sense when you've been paying attention from the beginning. This isn't about gossip. It's about boundaries, emotional labor, and the difference between reassurance that's offered freely and reassurance that arrives after cost. Staying engaged thoughtfully is how you keep those distinctions from getting lost, and how you make sure nuance survives in a space that usually rewards noise.